This week, the European Union announced a €750 billion stimulus package aimed at getting its 27 member countries through and out the other side of this global pandemic. But whether that effort will work ultimately depends on whether the fault lines within the Union can be managed. Writer Claire Berlinski is an American in Paris, as George Gershwin would have put it, a longtime observer of the EU, whose forthcoming book is called Brave Old World, Europe in the Age of Trump. And she joins us now for her perspective. I guess I really should have quoted a lyric from Irving Berlin, given your last name, but I couldn't resist with the George Gershwin thing. Anyway, Claire, how are you doing over there?
Well, we're doing just fine so far. Healthy. All's good.
Amen. Glad to hear that. About a week and a half ago, the German Chancellor and the French President announced a massive Euro recovery fund to distribute grants to the hardest hit parts of the EU, and some have called it a kind of a Hamiltonian moment in the history of the EU. How would you characterize it?
I think it is a Hamiltonian moment. I think it's a very, very important proposal. We're still waiting to see whether it can be approved by all 27 members of the EU, but the fact that it was proposed is a big milestone. It's a big change because Germany, of course, was absolutely unwilling to provide this kind of stimulus all through the financial crisis, the 2008-2012 financial crisis. And so this is a complete turnaround, a complete recognition on Merkel's part that without the rest of the EU, there's no future for Germany. And I was absolutely surprised by it. I didn't think I would see it. I really didn't expect it. They kept all the diplomacy under wraps. And it's very admirable that Angela Merkel has once again taken the initiative. This is the second time she's really surprised me. The first time was during the refugee crisis, and I think it's a very big step forward.
Now, obviously, not everybody's on the same page here. You've got, I guess, what they call the Frugal Four:
The Frugal
Netherlands,
Four, yeah.
Austria, Denmark, Sweden. They're opposed. What's the nature of their objections?
I don't know whether they're really opposed or whether it's, I don't think they were expecting it either, or perhaps they were. Perhaps there was a lot of diplomacy behind the scenes. They are of the view, at least nominally on paper, that these should be loans, not outright grants. But I suspect they're going to be steamrollered, because when you have both France and Germany on the same page and saying, we will, as the entire European Union community, we will take responsibility for these debts, I can't see how any one country could really stand in the way of that, stand in the way of first providing relief to the worst hit members of the EU. Because this is, the argument that there's a moral hazard, it doesn't make any sense in the context of a pandemic. This isn't because these countries took on bad debts, although in the case of Italy, there's a lot of bad debt. It's an act of God, and people really do need the help. I think it's an important moment. I didn't see it coming. It's important, though.
We're always breathless to report the latest polls on how much or little support there is for the EU among Europeans. So let me just do that right now, and I'll follow suit. Recent polling showing 60% of Italians, almost half the French, and 4 in 10 Germans believe the pandemic has weakened the case for the European Union. Do you think the EU has failed in its responsibility to rally support of the most afflicted countries?
Well, it certainly did initially. I don't know what the date of that poll is, but initially we saw scandalous behavior from the EU member countries. We saw hoarding of supplies. We saw obstruction of deliveries of critical emergency equipment. And other powers swooped in to take advantage of this. Russia actually landed military planes in Rome, which is a shocking sight. Russian soldiers in a convoy through a NATO country. And China proceeded with its so-called wolf diplomacy, a huge injection of humanitarian supplies, which was quite welcome, but also a lot of obnoxious nationalist rhetoric, even from its diplomats in the European Union. And I think that was a sobering sight to see how quickly Russia and China would swoop right in, which probably factored in Angela Merkel's decision.
Well, you've got an anonymous correspondent on your blog, who has made a bit of a checklist of the things that the EU has not done well lately. You just mentioned some of them. You could add to the list: the EU was incapable of stopping Brexit. It didn't make Poland or Hungary pay a price for its turn towards authoritarianism. It's really not able to provide a credible security guarantee to its members. NATO may be in decline, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Do you concur
All
with
true.
that view?
I
All
do.
true.
And oh, good. Did you say oh, good? It's not good.
No,
It's
I just
terrible.
no, I didn't say all good. I just said you said all true, and I said, oh, okay, you agree. All right.
Okay. No, all of those things are true. It failed to prevent Brexit, which is a terrible blow to the European Union, obviously. The EU was never meant to provide defense guarantees, but it's very obvious that with the United States becoming more and more unreliable, that some kind of arrangement for European security needs to be worked out, and no one believes the EU can be adapted to that task. In my view, the most damning of the items on that list is the failure to prevent Hungary and Poland from, they call it democratic backsliding, but I think that's a bit of a cliche. Failure to prevent Hungary, at least, from becoming a one-man dictatorship, and Poland from tampering with the judiciary and really reverting to a kind of a more primitive form of government. So there are a lot of things working against the EU, but I did not expect to see a proposal this bold come out of Germany. I do think it could. I think there are only two directions you can go. You can't have a monetary union without a fiscal union, ultimately. And I wrote on my newsletter, I wrote that the most realistic strategy at this point is unraveling the euro so that countries could have monetary independence at least. But failing that, the second most realistic strategy is a fiscal union, which I didn't expect to see a proposal for, and I'm surprised and encouraged to see it.
Well, I'm going to read something to you now, and it may sound familiar because you wrote it 14 years ago. Here's what you had to say. The European Union is historically nuts. It does not reflect the will of a single nation state or the will of an empire based on the ability of a central political entity to dominate its periphery or some form of established European national identity with deep historic roots. All of European history, all of world history, argues against a federation with no force to back it up and no way to impose its will upon member states. The EU
That's all true.
is, I'm not done yet, Claire. The EU is, in effect, an empty empire. The only national identities up for grabs are the old national identities of the chief nation states of Europe. Now, again, you wrote that back in 2006. Do you think you anticipate my questions so well all the time. I was going to say, do you think the events of the last few months bear out the empty empire appellation that you put on them 14 years ago?
It depends what you mean by that. Do I think that the EU shouldn't exist? No, I think the EU should exist. I think the EU is a very good idea. I think what I said then and what I stand by is the idea that this is a really tough thing to do. It's not easy to make a single political entity out of nation states that have been at war since the fall of the Roman Empire. There have been very few protracted periods of peace in Europe. Roughly since the Franco-Prussian War to the end of the Second World War, you saw the most violent conflict in human history on European soil. So it's not saying, well, there should be a union of European states is no trivial thing. It requires putting aside not only centuries of enmity, but very different national identities. There's no single language here. English was the closest thing there was in the European Union, and the UK dropped out. So it's a very difficult thing to do. But my question is, what's the alternative? What's the alternative? When you have the United States increasingly dysfunctional by the day, China and Russia bearing down on you, not to mention security crises coming northward from Africa and the Middle East region, the only future for Europe, and this is what Angela Merkel actually said, which also surprised me. She said there is no future for nation states on their own. The only future for Europe is united. So they have to try, and I applaud them for trying, and I wish them well.
You do sound a bit like Winston Churchill there in praising democracy by saying it's the worst form of government ever, except for everything else that's out there.
Well, except
That
that democracy has actually worked in the past. We have
hmm,
no real track record for the European Union, but yeah, that's right. There's no better alternative. The European Union is the only plausible hope for the independent nation states of Europe if they want to have an independent existence of any kind.
hmm. Justin Trudeau, soon after he became Prime Minister of Canada, this is back, I guess, 5 years ago or so now, called Canada the first post national state. Now, we haven't heard him talk that way since then, but do you think that Angela Merkel is getting similar resistance to that notion over there?
What do you think Justin Trudeau meant by that?
It's a good question. And I'm not sure, I'm not sure the average Canadian had a clue what he was talking about. And certainly there are plenty of people in Canada who just reject it outright. So I don't know
Well,
how to answer your question.
do you think he meant post-nationalist in the sense that Canada is a multi-ethnic nation that doesn't identify its sense of national unity with any particular ethnic group? Is that what he was getting at?
To be sure, yes, to be sure,
Mhm.
that would have been a part of it, which
Right.
very much goes against, I think, what a lot of people, it goes against how certainly a lot of francophones in this country see this country, which is a collection or a coming together of two founding peoples, English and French.
Mhm.
That was certainly more the case when his father was prime minister back in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. But somehow, you know what? You've turned this interview around where you're asking me questions about Canada, and I'm supposed to be asking you questions about the EU. How did that
Well, I
happen?
think they're related, though. The question is, what does it mean to say you're a post-nationalist political entity? And in the case of Canada, I would assume that my interpretation is correct, that what he meant was we have a sense of national identity that isn't an ethnic identity, and it's not an amalgamation of two ethnic identities. It's something that transcends these ethnic identities by virtue of commitment to a set of principles. Do you think he was getting at that?
Indeed, indeed, I'm sure that was all part of it. Um, but like for me, as I try to turn the tables on you and start to ask you questions again, I presume part of what motivates Europeans is that someday the French are going to stop seeing themselves just as French, but also equally as much as Europeans. That the Germans will stop seeing themselves only as Germans, but as Europeans. Is that
Yeah.
happening?
Well, I think that you have to see the EU as a not as a project for itself, but as a means to an end. It has always been viewed as a peace project. No one really cares whether the French see themselves as French or European, so long as they're not at war with Germany. Um, Nationalism was widely viewed as responsible for the catastrophe of the First World War. Whether that's entirely true is a matter of some historical debate. It's not entirely true. There are many reasons. But the European project, it's seen as a means to having peace on the continent, economic prosperity, and having a European entity that can stand up in the world against the other massive entities, China and the United States, most importantly, and Russia. I don't think anyone ever said we want to be one European family because we think that in itself would be such a great accomplishment. And I think that you see the lack of idealism, in some sense, with the failure to deal with Hungary, the failure to deal with what's increasingly happening in Poland. If the EU had been, as the United States likes to think, dedicated from the outset to an idea, I think it might have been very different. But the EU is a very pragmatic thing. It's a very pragmatic thing. It's intended to solve the problem of nation states that have long been at war with each other. It's intended to solve the problem of poverty. It's intended to solve the problem of each of these nation states being in a world of superpowers, unable to impose its will on the rest of the world. And to that extent, Hungary is just extra bodies.
How mischievous do you think Russia has been in trying to foment anti EU sentiment within the European Union?
Incredibly. So I think it's vastly underestimated in North America. I was going to say in the US, but I think in Canada too. People think of it as, a bit of a conspiracy theory. Russia isn't really doing that much damage, but it is. It absolutely floods Europe with propaganda and supports the most destructive far right and far left parties in Europe. And I really wonder, there must be someone making the decision to do this in Russia, be it Putin or someone underneath him in the intelligence services. And I really wonder how Russia thinks it would be helpful to Russia's national security to have a divided, warring Europe. And I felt this especially when as I've been watching Russia try to spread false information about COVID-19. How does Russia think it helps Russia to have a raging epidemic on its border?
Hmm.
And that could be a metaphor for all of Russia's interference in Europe. But I really reminds me of that Russian joke about Ivan the peasant who's granted a wish by the magic fish, who says, "I'll grant you any wish you want, but your neighbor gets twice as much." So Ivan says, "Make me blind in one eye." Yeah,
Right.
it's one of those jokes that really gives you a lot of insight, though, into the culture. I mean, there must just be a Russian culture, I think, is motivated by the deepest of resentment toward Europe, and that's the only explanation I can think of for the amount of damage they seem willing to do.
Let me do what I did before, and that is read you back to you again. Here's what you had to say. Now we're going back to the fall of 2019. Anyone who tells you we don't need Europe is lying. Anyone who tells Europeans they don't need us is lying. Look at the map. If liberal democracy falls in Europe, it will fail in the United States. If it fails in the United States, it will fall in Europe. If either fails, the West will no longer exist. Yet on both sides of the West, liberal democracy is on life support. How much of the difficulties facing the EU today do you think have to do with the crisis of liberal democracy writ large?
Quite a bit. We are obviously seeing a crisis of liberal democracy, and liberal democracy is the system of government that was both pioneered in the West and has achieved its fullest fruition in the West. So, of course, the crises are linked. We're not seeing a crisis of liberal democracy in East Asia, to the contrary, but we are seeing it in Europe, and we're seeing it in the United States.
Do you think that if there were a different president come next January, that some of this would go away?
It couldn't hurt. It couldn't hurt. I don't think all of it will go away. Certainly not. But I don't think it's hard to imagine someone doing more damage to liberal democracy than Donald Trump.
And in particular with the European Union?
Well, yes. I mean, he's lent his overt support to anti-democratic forces in the European Union. The encouragement of Brexit and the encouragement of political forces who are not interested in liberal democracy in Europe. He doesn't know what he's playing with. I don't think he has any idea who the different figures are, but it matters a lot. It matters a lot that his ambassador to Germany left the country on such bad terms that Germans were thinking this is the way a hostile occupying power would sound. Even though I think Grinnell it's his former ambassador to Germany, now he was for a short time the intelligence chief. There were some legitimate diplomatic complaints. I think the United States is absolutely right to criticize Germany for accepting Nord Stream 2 project, which makes all of Europe dependent for Russia for its energy supplies. I think that was a legitimate complaint, but the way Grinnell handled it was completely counterproductive. He alienated everyone in Germany, and no one takes the complaint seriously anymore because they see it as an aspect of Trump's general lunacy, which is unfortunately something Trump has discredited a lot of things that I otherwise think are important American values.
I thought General Lunacy was the head of the Pentagon these days. No, I must have missed that appointment. That's wrong. Claire, it's been great to meet you. talk to you.
Are we
I
done?
confess I haven't had too many interviews where the person I'm interviewing actually asked me nearly as many questions as I ask her. It was completely delightful on this end, and I hope we get to do this again someday. Stay
Are
safe
we?
over
Was
there,
that it?
okay?
That was really quick.
Well, that's just an indication that you and I both had a good time. Because
Yeah.
if it felt like 45 minutes, that would not be a good sign. Thank you so much, Claire Berlinski.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.